I'm your host, Cenk Uygur. Now we got a great guest for you, Juan, professor at the University of Michigan, one of the top experts in the Middle East, on the Middle East here in the United States. Professor Cole, welcome back to the Young Turks.
Thanks so much.
So I want to start by talking about not the results yet. I'd like to talk about that in a little bit, but the reasons why Israel has done this ground invasion of Gaza Strip. They claim that Hamas broke the ceasefire by doing rocket attacks against them, and that they had no choice. They had to retaliate to protect their population. Are there problems with that theory?
Well, I mean, any time a politician says they had no choice but to do something, you know they're lying. There's always choices. The question is how you get to your objectives. It is certainly the case that Hamas has subjected Israeli towns such as Sderot and Ashkelon to bombardment by these homemade rockets. And they have, over the years, since 2000, killed on the order of 15 people with those rockets. They've also done property damage, not insignificant property damage. So it's not that there's no issue there about the Hamas rockets. However, in the 6 months leading up to the Israeli attack, no Israelis had been killed by rockets. And Hamas was indicating a desire to renegotiate the truce, since the truce involved supposedly Hamas not attacking Israel, but then the Palestinians being left alone. It really wasn't working very well because the Israelis had a blockade on Gaza, which wasn't even letting in enough food for people to avoid malnutrition. So Hamas said, you know, this is not a proper truce, and we're not going to go on with this arrangement. And so this attack is Israel's reply to Hamas's putting its feet down.
All right, Professor Cole, I want to understand a couple of things there. One, my understanding was that Israel started bombing the tunnels before Hamas started firing the rockets into Israel. Is that right or wrong?
Well, there was in November a bombing. I don't think it really plays into this particular operation very much, in the sense that we know that this has been planned by the Israeli High Command for 6 months.
So by doing the blockade and perhaps that bombing of the tunnel, etc., were they trying to goad Hamas into breaking the ceasefire, or what was their stated purpose for the blockade, which appears to break the ceasefire?
Right. Well, you know, the Israelis don't like Hamas. They don't want it to exist. They don't want it to control Gaza. It won the 2006 elections for the Palestine Authority, which was unacceptable to the Israelis and to the Americans, and they assiduously then attempted to undermine the results of those elections. They promoted a coup against Hamas. They bottled it up in Gaza, and then they tried to strangle it there. And they attempted to strangle it while trying to convince Hamas not to attack them, which, you know, is not going to work very well. But the Israelis think they can destroy Hamas militarily. They think those tunnels were bringing in war material, explosives and so forth, and some of them were, but they were also bringing in food, which the Israelis weren't allowing in enough quantities to nourish people.
So let's talk about that, because I think that's one of the principal things. We're talking to Professor Juan Cole from the University of Michigan. His blog is called Informed Comment. You can find it at juancole.com. Do they really believe that they can extinguish Hamas? That seems to be an untenable prospect. There's 20,000 Hamas fighters. Are they going to kill them all? I don't see the rationale of Israel's endgame here.
Well, as I understand it, the Israeli political class and officers have accepted a theory coming out of some work in political science and game theory, that if you can destroy even a fourth of an organization, you can cause it to collapse. So the number of fighters is not so material as is the structure of command. So if you can kill a fourth of the commanders, then the thing will fall down. And, you know, these game theorists have in mind Western corporations and bureaucracies and so forth when they theorize in this way. But I think the Israelis just have bought this kind of thinking, which is too smart for its own good, and tried to apply it to a situation where it doesn't apply, because Hamas is involved with clans and kinship, and it's not like IBM or the Ministry of Interior.
Yeah, I mean, I find that absurd. Yeah, I'm sure if you killed a quarter of IBM, they'd be in a lot of trouble. But Hamas is not like that. I mean, that's crazy for them to even begin to think of that analogy as being relevant here. So let's think it through this endgame now. Israel goes in and they kill, I assume, some Hamas fighters and a lot of civilians. And a week goes by, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months goes by. And they haven't killed all the Hamas people, and the Hamas people haven't all surrendered, and they haven't collapsed. Then what happens?
Well, I think the Israelis know that they don't have that kind of time. And it's being speculated by Jane's Defense Weekly that they'll do this for about another 10 days.
So, okay, then what happens at the end of 10 days? I'm really curious about that, because
Well, they'll withdraw, believing that they have inflicted this kind of damage on Hamas that will then cause it to collapse.
That's ridiculous. I didn't expect to laugh during this interview, but that's laughable. So what happens when Hamas comes back and starts firing rockets again?
Well, this is all deja vu all over again, After all, Ariel Sharon pursued a vigorous campaign of assassination of the Hamas leadership some years ago. And killed Sheikh Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas, who was in a wheelchair coming out of a mosque with followers, including children. And they hit him with a helicopter gunship. They hit him with a missile fired by a helicopter gunship as he was coming out of the mosque, and just wiped him out and 17 other people too. And then they killed Rantisi, the political leader of Hamas, and they killed a large number of them, and they were working on the same theory. That if you kill enough of the high command, you can cause the thing to collapse. So then, of course, they didn't cause it to collapse, and indeed it took over the Palestine Authority only a few years later in January of 2006, much to the Israelis' dismay. So they'll go on doing this, forever. They're stuck in this kind of Groundhog Day kind of repeat of history over and over and over again, because they won't learn the lesson that this doesn't work.
Well, that's both silly. Well, look, I'll be blunt. That's both stupid and immoral. Let's talk about the two different sides of it. Let's talk about stupid first. If they think Hamas collapses and then Fatah comes in to take over the Gaza Strip on Israeli tanks, I mean, they can't be that stupid, can they? Wouldn't that delegitimize Fatah and cause them more damage within the Palestinian territories?
Well, absolutely, and that's the reason for which Mahmoud Abbas has made it very clear that he's unwilling to do any such thing. But the Israelis are always looking for people they can use to supplant their enemies, and the irony here is that back in the 80s, when the secular Palestine Liberation Organization was the main Palestinian political vehicle and was thought too close to the Soviet Union and too left and secular, the Israelis funneled money to Hamas to divide and rule. So they, kind of like the Piper of Hamelin story, they brought in the cats to deal with the rats, and then they ended up having a lot of cats.
Okay. You know what? I hear that from time to time. Unfortunately, I haven't researched that more thoroughly. Is that for real? Because that seems unbelievable. How did they give money to Hamas in the 1980s?
The Mossad just had accounts that funneled it in. It's Richard Sale, who's the UPI terrorism correspondent, is a veteran terrorism correspondent, has covered the Middle East for decades, has a series of articles which are easily Googled on the web. Richard Sales, S-A-L-E-S. And he's done good interviewing with intelligence officials who have alleged this.
Yeah, because that's a brilliant idea. What you really want is radical Muslim opponents against Israel and to send them money. God, that is...
Well, but that's what the Reagan administration did in Afghanistan.
No, I know, but at least Afghanistan was half a world away from the United States, and to me that sounded somewhat logical. Yeah, you're playing a risky game there, but if you're Israel and you give money to radical Islamic people that are right next to you, that are, I mean, it's madness. I think it's all right. So look, I've learned this lesson well over the last 6 months and 6 years, which is that the people in charge are a lot dumber than we suspect. So I'm going to move on.
Well, you know, it's not just dumb; it's also short-sighted. I mean, these guys have a 6-month time window. They're thinking of solving a problem over the next 6 months, right? They're not thinking about 10 years or 20 years.
See, that's a great point. You're exactly right, because people always wonder why. How can they be this stupid? But it's not just that they're stupid; it's that they have a different time frame than because they got elections coming up, and they're concerned about that. And on the financial side, they're concerned about taking their bonus home in December, and they're not worried about what happens 2 years from now. And that's why these decisions wind up with terrible long-term consequences. Now, we're talking to Professor Juan Cole from Michigan. Professor, I want to talk about the moral side of this equation, too. We're told that Hamas are terrorists and they kill civilians, and I think they do kill civilians, and if you want to define that as terrorists, yes, and it's terrible, and we tell them to be nonviolent. I do on this show all the time. Now, at the same time, as you mentioned, Israel is dropping bombs on their leaders and any civilian that happens to be around them. In fact, they just killed the top Hamas leader. His name, of course, is, you know it, Nizar Ryan, and they killed his whole family with him. 4 wives, I think about 6 kids or so. If Hamas had done that to the military and political leader, or one of the military and political leaders of Israel, Ehud Barak, and killed his whole family, would that not be indisputably considered terrorism in the West?
Well, of course, there is a double standard with regard to the definition of terrorism. What states do is not defined as terrorism in international law. Terrorism is, by definition, an action of a non-state actor. I believe it's one of the reasons for which the Israeli leadership is so, behind the scenes, opposed to allowing the Palestinian Authority to become a regular state, because at the moment they can deny Palestinian actors legitimacy of a state. But certainly there's such a thing as state terror, and the United States and Britain and France and Israel and China are all guilty of that. But it is true that it's often as condemnable as the terrorism of non-state actors.
Now, how about this idea of the right to exist? Israel says, well, wait a minute, we can't negotiate with Hamas. Hamas doesn't even recognize our right to exist. So I want to ask you, because I'm not entirely positive, one of our listeners asked, and I thought you're the perfect person to ask this question, has Israel ever said Hamas has a right to exist?
Well, the real question is, has Israel ever said that the Palestinians have a right to a state?
Right.
And I suppose, kind of, in the Oslo Agreement and the Oslo Accords and the handshake between Rabin and Arafat, there was a kind of grudging Israeli pledge that the Palestinians would eventually have a state. But they haven't recognized a Palestinian state as yet. So they've admitted the principle of it. So I suppose they, are a little bit ahead of Hamas on that in that regard. But Hamas would say, look, why should we give up the only bargaining chip we have in our negotiations with our enemy by recognizing the enemy, which is what the enemy wants, before we get anything out of it?
Well, look, I understand that point, but all of this is so silly because if Hamas doesn't, concede that Israel exists, does it not exist? Of course it exists. I mean, this is all semantics. This is silliness. So what are they actually going for here? I mean, do you think that Hamas is willing to make a deal with Israel, and Israel could ever negotiate with a Palestinian government that includes Hamas? And what would be the contours of that deal?
Well, so far the answer is no. The Israelis will not negotiate with a government that includes Hamas, and indeed, when Hamas was the government of the Palestine Authority, they simply kidnapped the ministers of the government and jailed them.
I mean, look, the hypocrisy of the West knows no bounds. I mean, we just kidnapped their government. They're like, oh, that's interesting. Hey, imagine if they kidnapped Condoleezza Rice and Don Rumsfeld and Norm Mineta. The world would have been on fire.
That's the kind of thing that was going on. In fact, our press used the word captured, which I'm not sure is the appropriate one. But Hamas says, The Hamas leaders have from time to time said, look, we won't recognize Israel and we won't have a formal peace treaty with it, but we would be willing to consider a 100-year truce. Well, I mean, that would be good enough for me.
Yeah, that's a good start. That's a good start. I can live with that. So that's what Hamas has said.
Yeah.
Okay, so, Professor Cole, final question for you, and it's probably the toughest after all this, but how do we resolve this? Because Israel is being insanely obstinate. If Hamas got elected, they are the representatives of the Palestinian people. You don't get to pick your enemies. And this idea of killing a quarter or, so that they collapse, it's not going to work. You and anybody who knows the Middle East knows it's not going to work. And so eventually Hamas is going to come back. And if Hamas, you say that they're willing to consider a 100-year truce, but so far all they've done is fire rockets, even though it's an enemy they can't possibly ever defeat militarily. What's the end game here? How do they ever make peace in this situation?
Well, I mean, the main hope in the 90s was that there would be a two-state solution, which would evolve into a peace between the two, the Palestinian and the Israeli state. Israeli continued colonization of the West Bank has increasingly made it, I think, very unlikely that there can be a Palestinian state. And so I think the two-state solution is probably dead. I think the Obama administration may try to revive it. I'm not sure. I think it may be a corpse. So if there's not a two-state solution, then the three major possibilities are apartheid, which is what we've got now de facto, and just the kind of formalization and extension of that, or a one-state solution, which of course the Israelis are very opposed to, or what the Israelis call transfer, or the ethnic cleansing of the remaining Palestinians in Palestine. Those seem to me to be the three possible outcomes.
No, that's the first time I've heard that, Professor. That can't be the three choices. I mean, the cleansing is crazy. They're not going to transfer these people to other Arab countries. That's not a.
Oh well, I mean, I think that were the Egyptians not so absolutely adamant that they don't want any Gazans, that Gaza would now have fled to Egypt. I mean, people would have just gone out. It's only that the Egyptians have troops there and are firing at them if they try to come in.
Professor Cole, do you have any information that the Israelis are seriously considering that option number 3?
Well, that there are Israelis who are in favor of it. Former cabinet minister Avigdor Lieberman is a big advocate of it, and it's something that's spoken of by a lot of Likud party members. And in fact, in opinion polls, it's a rising option for a lot of Israelis. No, it's something that's taken very seriously in Israel.
Oh boy! And I promised I had a final question about 3 questions ago, but I don't know the state of the Israeli polling. Does Netanyahu have a real shot at winning the elections that are coming up soon?
Yes. The question is whether this particular operation will have made Kadima and Labor more popular, because Netanyahu and Likud had been attacking them as wimps. So they may be lots of things, but you can't say they're wimps at this point. And they're hoping that I think that they will improve their standing at the polls. So
is it a toss-up at this point?
I think so.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, Juan Cole, professor at the University of Michigan. His blog is Informed Comment. You can find it at juancole.com. Professor Cole, thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. Really appreciate it.
It's my great pleasure.